The constitutional order, the Constitution was passed in 1917. The constitutional order looks really nice. It's sort of American-like with lots of promises and freedoms. And actually, there's been research on constitutions around the world. Geez, what was her name? Jennifer Widener, I think. Was She was a comparativist at Princeton for a while, and she was doing some research on constitutions. I don't know where it went, but this is something interesting to look at, all the colorful language and to what degree it comes out of international pressures, and even international institutions from human rights institutions within the United Nations. For whatever reason, lots of promises and freedoms, but under the PRI, again, you had a very strong president who was really in charge. He handpicked governors, he controlled the legislature up until 1997. And of course, the PRI controlled the presidency up until 2000. So we'll start with the judiciary. This is a lot like the U.S. judiciary, though it's been highly politicized and historically subservient to the PRI. By the 1990s, for the first time, the judiciary becomes more activist. So to be on the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court, I guess I should highlight a couple things. Usually there are no jury trials, but you do have the right to appeal to a federal judge in terms of the local courts. Now, the Supreme Court members, like in the United States, are appointed by the president, but they're confirmed by the Senate. And they're limited here, unlike in our system, to a 15-year term. So you can imagine what that means to be a Supreme Court justice. It's a little bit different than in the United States. I may throw up a question about this on the discussion board. The powers that they have are the power of concrete judicial review, exactly like ours. But was it meaningful? Not really, not until recently, because they didn't challenge the PRI, because they were handpicked by the PRI, they're the PRI's people, and because, well, if you've got a 15-year limit on the term that you're serving, you need to be looking out for a soft landing. And this is also a very common thing. It's one of the problems with term limits in various institutions. So you're looking out for where your next place is going to be, and you don't want to rock any particular boat. In terms of the presidency, and I don't have Nieto up here, I've got Vicente Fox and Calderon. The president is elected directly every 6 years. You know what the prime minister does in Mexico, right? What does the prime minister do? I know you know. That's right. The prime minister does nothing, because there is no prime minister. It's a presidential system. So the president is the head of state and the head of government. What the president does is he introduces legislation, he can veto legislation, he controls key natural resources, aka oil, as well as infrastructure, for example, electricity, communications. The president's responsible for appointing and obviously dominates the cabinet. It's a lot like in our system. The cabinet is seen as a stepping stone to the president. So not entirely unlike our system, although how many cabinet officials actually go on and become president. So I guess it's a little bit different. The president in Mexico can rule by decree, sort of like American executive orders. They're partially based on this notion of decrees, but they're far more limited in scope and generally subject to judicial review in the American case. So you have had significant rule by decree in Mexico. So when Fox comes into power, and I'm just telling you this because it's sort of anecdotal, but it gives you an idea of what it means to transition in a place like this. He comes to power and he's got this highly inexperienced cabinet. This is the nature of democratization. And what happens is you've got this chaos, you've got confusion. He also didn't have a majority in Congress, and so he was very weak. So under Fox, the Congress, which was dominated by the opposition, became more assertive, and they voted against the president's legislation quite frequently. And Fox came from this party, this PAN party, PAN party, but his closest advisors were not actually from PAN. And there were enormous expectations of Vicente Fox, and he just couldn't actually come through on a lot of those. In terms of the legislature, one of the most important aspects of the legislature is Article 59 of the Constitution, which states that legislators cannot be elected to consecutive terms. So one question that I'm very likely to put up on the discussion board is I want you to think about the good and the bad of this. So legislators cannot be elected to consecutive terms. What does this mean? What does this mean in terms of gridlock, in terms of having legislation passed? What does it mean in terms of corruption? What does it mean for all these things? And I'm almost invariably going to put this discussion question up because it's a really important aspect of the Mexican legislature and politics more generally. So the lower house of the Mexican Congress is known as the Chamber of Deputies, composed of 500 members. What they do is, of course, they pass laws, they can levy taxes, they also verify the elections. Another interesting point is how they come into being. This is a mixed system. You have 300 SMDs, 300 who come through an SMD vote, and then 200 through a PR system. And we'll talk about the meaning of that in a couple minutes. In terms of the upper house, this is the Senate, composed of 128 members, 3 from each state, as well as 32 seats that are elected via proportional representation, another PR vote, with an extremely low threshold of only 2%. In terms of the power of the Senate, they confirm presidential appointments to the Supreme Court, which we mentioned. They have to approve treaties, just like in the United States. They also have to approve federal intervention in state matters. So that's an important power that they have. So this is one where the lower house is not necessarily stronger than the upper house, just like in our system in the United States. So I want to talk about the parties. You've got the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, which I keep talking about. I probably should have mentioned that that's what PRI is. I didn't even think about that. PRI stands for Institutional Revolutionary Party. And this is a party that's supposed to represent the Mexican state interests, and that's pretty much what it is. It historically lacked any particular ideology, right? Mexican state interests. Well, do you need an ideology for that? Sometimes it was more leftist, sometimes it was more on the right. What they did is they fostered patron-client relations. So the government would give state services and access to power to individuals in return for their political support. And this went all the way down the line. So you have very large informal networks of political cliques, which are crucial to the PRI maintaining power. The PRI was also able to mobilize the population, huge mobilization, especially the workers and peasants, whose organizations, as I mentioned before, were actually brought into the state and more directly into the PRI structure, or more accurately, I should say. Same thing with businesses. Businesses under PRI would give lots of campaign money to the PRI, and then they would receive benefits. Now, this support, as I mentioned before, began to erode in 1982 as you had increased urbanization. And with increased urbanization, you've got a better educated population, or at least a segment of the population that's better educated. You also have a rising, wealthier, politically independent class. But also key here is the poor economy, which damages the PRI's ability to use patronage. In other words, they lose their ability to co-opt. So way back when we talked about co-option and coercion, cooptation and coercion as two possible ways to maintain power, two likely ways to maintain power. This was not a highly coercive apparatus. There was coercion, especially in the southern areas and in the poor areas, but primarily this was a system that was based on co-optation. Again, this patronage system. Well, when you lose money, when you don't have money anymore, or when you have when your resource base declines, it's much harder to be able to afford that. And so, by the early 1990s, they'd engaged in these neoliberal economic reforms, trying to get the economy to bounce back. But this hurts people even more. They still are the strongest party, and as I mentioned, they've just come back to power, to controlling the presidency. They controlled half the governorships and had a plurality in the chamber throughout the period when Vicente Fox was in power, I believe. They had a leadership crisis around 2000. That's what happens when you lose the elections, right? We just saw in the most recent elections, the Republicans also had a sort of period of introspection, I guess. Why did we lose? And the Democrats have done that too, right? The 2000s, how do we keep losing to George Bush? So then how do we lose to Obama? So this period of introspection was going on here as well, and clearly something came out of it because the PRI candidate won in the most recent elections. Today, though, the PRI is much more centrist with support for neoliberal policies. So that's where the PRI stands today. In terms of the left, parties on the left, you've got the Party of Democratic Revolution, the PRD. The PRD was the Popular Socialist Party before a PRI faction joined. And they, throughout the 1980s and 1990s in particular, attacked the neoliberal reforms that the PRI was pursuing, and that's why you had a PRI faction joining this party on the left. Because again, remember, the PRI was not an ideological party, so it wasn't on the left or the right. And so when people who have aspirations, or I should say ideological affinities towards the left, saw the neoliberal policies, they said, hey, this party is no longer our party. Well, it never really was from an ideological standpoint. But they joined the left party, the Party of Democratic Revolution. So they attacked these neoliberal reforms throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The PRID tends to be sort of nationalist, protectionist. It was very popular in Mexico City, but also in the South. And that's not a surprise, where you've got the attack on these reforms that are hurting the poorest people, and that's what neoliberal reforms tend to do. Then you're going to find more support for that, and that's the southern areas in particular. So this was actually created as a communist workers' party, and then they changed their name in 1960, and then they broke off later. But it is a center-left party. So finally, we've got on the right the National Action Party, PAN. They defected from the PRI way earlier, back in 1939, and they've been historically strongest in the north and weakest in the rural areas. This is sort of a standard European Christian Democratic Party in some ways. It's very pro-devolution. So historically it was split between Catholic conservatives and progressive technocrats. They place a stress on free enterprise, privatization, smaller government, but also so these very liberal reforms. And again, when I say liberal, think of liberal in terms of comparative politics, because that's obviously what I mean. They're clearly not liberals from the U.S. understanding of the word liberal. They've also got opposition to same-sex unions, abortion, so the Catholic conservatives have really come out on top. So just to give you an idea of where all these groups stand, in the 2009 elections to the lower house, the PRI got 207 seats, the PAN, P-A-N, got 114 seats, and the PRD got 100 seats. So it just gives you an idea of where these groups stand. So there are three major political parties, the PAN, the PRI, and the PRD. But the distribution means that PAN, which a third of all voters means really PAN goes up against the PRI. And then you've got the PRID. So PAN is dominant again in the north. The PRI is also has a heavy presence in the north and west. And then the PRID has the heavy presence in the south. With the SMD system, the fact that the PRID has a strong region, what's the word I'm looking for? Oh, you're not there. You can't tell me. A strong regional base. People are a strong concentration means that despite the fact that they only have 10% of all voters identifying with them, they actually get significant more of the seats because they win lots of SMD seats. So in 2000, again, you had the first really free presidential elections. PRI came out as populists, PAN came out as democratizers, and the PRD was really the only anti-neoliberal group out there. So PRI and PAN were basically all supporting this neoliberal move. By 2006, this had turned to sort of regular pro-poor versus pro-business politics. And Calderon barely won by just 200,000 seats. So it's important to understand when Calderon came to power, he wasn't particularly popular per se. So given the electoral system, I want you to think about why we might be talking about essentially a three-party system. And really, I suppose in some ways it's closer to a 2.5-party system. Although with the regional concentration, the PRD has actually been able to make it a 3-party system from that perspective. So can you imagine this changing, I guess is the question. And I might put this up, I might not, but it's something to think about. Think about how this might change and look at the electoral institutions that are in place. And just a little hint, if I do put this up, you can find other parties that are out there. The Labor Party, the Convergence Party, those guys actually joined the PRID for a while. But then you've got the Ecologists Green Party of Mexico, the New Alliance, Social Democratic Party, the Peasant Alternative Party. The point being, I probably won't put this up as discussion at this point because I'm making a key point here, which is that really these groups have gotten into power in part thanks to alliances, but in part thanks to the PR portion of the votes. So it's important to keep in mind that the PR portion does allow for other parties to get involved, and they have in the Mexican state system. So should I take a break? Jeez, I guess I could. All right, I'll stop it here and take the next slide.